Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. A few hours after we taped this week's conversation, the United States and Israel launched military strikes on Iran. Iran retaliated with hits on Israel and on U.S. targets across the Middle East. The initial wave of attacks eliminated Iran's top leadership, including Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. But by Sunday, Iran's counterstrikes had already killed 3 U.S. service members and at least 9 in Israel. It's still too early to know the full-scale loss of life, how the conflict will play out, or what the political impact might be. But some things were clear even before the attacks began. At the end of the episode, we talk about why Trump didn't even try to prepare the public or the Congress for the operation, and why he is perfectly ill-fit to lead the country into it. Elsewhere this week, Trump slogged through the longest State of the Union in history. Clocking in at 108 minutes, it felt even longer. The president rattled off scores of lies about his record, punctuated with a dystopian rant about crime, immigration, and of course, woke and unpatriotic Democrats. Less than a day later, the news cycle had moved back onto the administration's least favorite topic, the Epstein scandal. Reporters pinpointed dozens of pages involving allegations against Trump that the DOJ either took down or failed to produce. At the same time, the department faced new anger for over-disclosure after it released documents that identified Epstein victims and even cooperating witnesses. To take stock of the long-winded State of the Union, the increased scrutiny of Epstein documents that seemed to include Trump, and the state of play with military hostilities against Iran, we're joined by 3 of the most trenchant analysts in the country. And they are Susan Glasser, a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she writes a column on life in Washington and where she co-hosts the political scene podcast, Washington Roundtable. She previously served as editor of several DC-based publications. Susan, always a pleasure to welcome you.
Great to be with you, Harry. Thank you.
Bill Kristol, editor-at-large for The Bulwark. He's also the founder and director of Defending Democracy Together, and he hosts the video and podcast series Conversations with Bill Kristol. He served in senior positions in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations. Bill, thanks so much for joining.
Good to be with you, Harry, and good to be with Susan and John, too.
And Bill did the reveal, Jon Lemire, a staff writer at The Atlantic. Congratulations on that relatively new appointment. He also serves as co-host of MS Now's Morning Joe. John's covered the White House since 2016 in his roles as White House bureau chief of Politico, and before that, as a White House correspondent for the Associated Press. Thanks for being on Talking Feds on this State of the Union week.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Let's start with you, John, because you wrote ahead of the State of the Union that it could be Trump's best chance to begin the sort of comeback he needs. Before we talk about the actual speech Trump delivered, what could it have been? What did it need to be? What might he have achieved with the address?
I mean, we shouldn't overstate, of course, the importance of any one speech, particularly in a news cycle that's this fast and furious. But this is the biggest audience he'll face all year, and his aides had hoped that he would be able to deliver a message that would at least stabilize what has been an avalanche of terrible polls for him and Republicans in recent months. The election defeats in November, a number of special election losses since, including in some very red districts like in Texas and Louisiana. He's underwater in the polls on some of his signature issues like the economy and on immigration. And there was a hope that at the very least here he could sell his accomplishments, but perhaps acknowledge that more work needed to be done and lay out some sort of plan going forward. As we'll get into, he didn't really do that. I don't think he steadied the nerves of too many Republicans who right now are frankly in a quiet panic about how things look for their party ahead of November's midterms.
Got it. And Susan, let me move to you because covering the actual speech, you saw it as hopeless to try to make him give the great policy address that his aides had not just hoped for, but actually advertised. They said that that's what he would do. And yet the message could not have been otherwise. I'm quoting from your New Yorker piece. Trump's default setting is triumphalism. So combining John's point, did that one trick pony aspect of him deserve him at a moment when the country is glum and looking for solutions?
I think it's just not in Donald Trump's wiring to be offering up the kind of case for anything. He's not a persuader, right? He is a pitchman. He is a salesman, and he has a default setting that is all caps, exclamation point, Panglossian, like any country that would have me as its leader, obviously is doing great. And I think, interestingly, this also was just, whatever you think of any kind of policy idea or prescription, right? Mostly there were none of those. But more importantly, like it was incoherent to the point of jarring, right? So you did have this Panglossian, everything is fantastic, beginning and end of the speech, with about a 40 minutes in the middle of American hellscape and the evil Democrats and illegal aliens who are destroying the country and, rampaging Somali pirates and, the whole carnival of grotesqueness that Trump offers as I think his way of rallying his followers and stiffening their spine because he's concerned about the turnout in the midterms. But to Jonathan's point, I have to say, right, like the idea that these White House officials every year with Trump, they put out this veneer of normalcy, this game of pretend, right, where Caroline Leavitt goes out and she speaks to reporters hours before this speech, which again, Trump was largely reading the speech. So these people wrote this speech and put it into a teleprompter. They had some Trumpian, like ad libs and riffs, but basically they knew what was in the damn speech. And yet they still go out. It's fascinating. And she comes out to the media and she says, yes, this speech is going to be a well-argued case for why Republicans and President Donald Trump are better positioned to help Americans respond to the affordability crisis in the country, right? Like this speech was not that. And even if it wasn't delivered by Donald Trump, any human being who read those words on that teleprompter, that's not what this was, right? And you have at the heart, I think, of this election year, this really fascinating dynamic emerging where his political strategists and advisors want Donald Trump to address an affordability crisis, which is interesting that she even used that term.
Yeah.
That he doesn't deep down believe exists. And you cannot convince Americans that you are going to address a problem that you don't think exists.
You wrote it. If Tuesday's speech proved anything, it's that it's hard to explain how we're going to get America out of a mess that you don't believe exists. I want to come back to the speech in a moment, but Bill, you've been in the position of these aides. I wonder, we have Ezra Klein saying that Trump actually believes his own bullshit. And it's similar to what Susan's saying, that it could only be this. Let's say that's right. What sorts of challenges does it pose, both for his staff and the Republican caucus, knowing that he simply can't be deterred from his triumphalist, rhetoric alloyed with the dark 40-minute hellscape that Susan described?
This was so long ago, but in a different era, to say the least, of American politics. But when I was in the George H.W. Bush White House as the vice president, chief of staff, there was always this focus on this. There always is. The staff loves the State of the Union, but you get to fight for 2 months about what's going to be in it, and you get to send in your favorite formulation.
You get your own half sentence, and
which of course doesn't make it in, and then you can of course blame the failures of the administration for the next year and the fact that they didn't take your paragraph or your sentence. It's very useful. But if you're the incumbent, like you're judged by results. There's only so much you can do. You can do a little spinning, obviously, but you're judged by results. And in that respect, Trump is not an ineffective, in his own way, salesman or con man, right? He did get himself nominated 3 times by the Republican Party, including the first time when they'd never before nominated, or certainly we'd never elected someone who hadn't been in political office or in a cabinet. I guess Republicans nominated one or two businessmen who then lost. He got himself elected. He went through being president for 4 years, January 6th, everything else, got himself nominated again and elected again. So he's a pretty good candidate when he's out of office. Not a good candidate in the sense of good for the country, but good for himself, you got to say. But then you can run against the hellscape, which is his more natural. His more natural mode is, I think Susan is right, is everything's horrible and I'm going to fix it. And I alone can fix it. That is right. And I'm with you against the terrible people who are in office who are not with you. That's a coherent message, sort of. And I've got 5 simple solutions. And he was pretty good at that in 2016 and pretty good at it actually in 2024. We shouldn't underestimate just the political talent he showed in coming back from January 6th over those next 3 years. When you're president, you're judged by results, and B, to the degree you can affect how people see things, you sort of have to defend your record. I mean, or explain that you're going to pivot a little bit from your record, Clinton sort of thing. This part of your record's being underestimated, or you can do versions of that. It doesn't fit very well, though, with the America's a hellscape thing. And I do think Susan's really onto something. One of the real, I didn't watch the speech. I can't watch him, but I read it the next morning, which is that transcripts are a wonderful invention. We really owe a lot to whoever invented transcripts, I'm going to say. You can read them pretty quickly. You don't have to listen to all the insane applause and all this stuff, or the booing, I suppose. And but when you read it, you're very struck by this. Well, what's his message? I mean, usually they begin, right? Incumbent presidents, the famous beginning, the iconic beginning. The State of the Union is strong, or the State of the Union is healthy, or the State of the Union is something, and that's okay. And then you can try to persuade people that's a little healthier than they thought it was, and that's not crazy. And certainly Trump has some material. I'm the last person to give Trump credit for anything, but Trump has some material to work with. I mean, inflation is down a little bit. Growth is down a little bit too, but he could say that at least in third quarter was pretty strong, and the stock market's up. It wouldn't be, he's inherited certain things from Biden that haven't gone wrong. Tariffs hasn't been as disastrous so far, I think, as a lot of economists said. It wouldn't be crazy for him to try to give us the drug price thing is mostly phony, but there's a little truth to it, I think. And, it wouldn't be crazy to give the State of the Union is better than it was a year ago speech. It's a little crazy as an incumbent to give the State of the Union is horrible speech and every place is a hellhole, but I suppose you could try to still blame Biden for that and then say you're fixing it. But you can't give both at once. And I do think in that respect, it just was incoherent. And we're speaking on Friday. I feel like it was a month ago. We're discussing it here, so I'll give you credit for that, Harry. But honestly, by Sunday or Monday, it's not going to be the biggest story of the last week, right? I mean, so I don't think it's a speech that has any lasting effect, honestly.
John, what about this tone point? He did make certain triumphal claims that just were completely false, like a miraculous turnaround for the economy. But then there was this middle piece of I was reminded of his very bizarre inauguration in 2017, the darkness of it. Was that just trying to reach the faithful at that point? And that combination, did it strike you as self-defeating, basically?
Trump only has so many notes. His color palette is pretty limited. And I think that, yes, to agreeing with what Bill just said, he made the few things he was able to make a decent argument on. And then the middle felt, and frankly, with some pretty graphic descriptions of violence and injury. It was sort of almost like a slasher film there for a little while. And, it also is noteworthy for what it didn't include. And I know we're going to talk more about Iran later in this show, but the fact that we seem to be potentially on the verge of a war, and he had a national audience and made no effort to make a case to justify the conflict or why it would be in Americans' interests for him to do this is striking. And I think that it was people I've talked to in the last couple of days. Again, no one was expecting a home run that would change the trajectory of his presidency, but they hoped it would just help a little. And I'm not sure it did. I don't know that it hurt him necessarily, but it didn't help. And I think that Republicans who were looking for something more came away disappointed. And I do think more than anything, it's because Trump is unable, if he's not blaming Joe Biden, there was plenty of that. And poll after poll suggests that Americans are saying, hey, this is your economy now. You own this. Like you can't be blaming your predecessor any longer. But if he's not blaming Biden, he's unable to ever admit that something isn't the biggest, the best, the greatest. And that's simply a disconnect for what so many Americans are feeling. And I think that's what I came away with. And a number of people in both parties I've talked to in the last couple of days, that was their takeaway. That first of all, we have a 4-hour show every morning and we couldn't fact check every lie. We're running out of time. But more than that, just that he seems so out of touch. It really reinforces his belief. Every president's a bubble. I don't know that anyone's ever been quite as isolated or his own reality as this one is right now. And there's a sense that the story he was telling about the economy simply wasn't Americans' lived experiences. And that's not going to help him or his party.
And record-breaking length, breaking his own, such terrible food in such huge portions. Maybe it's even, at least in his hands, something that is a big tradition but doesn't really mean anything anymore. Susan, I think in your piece, you talk about Obama's speechwriter, Jon Favreau, saying it's become a relic of a speech that barely matters for even the 24 hours everyone's paying attention. Time to retire the State of the Union tradition, you think?
It's interesting you say that. I think there's something to it. I mean, I found these things to be terrible and impossible to listen to, even outside of the Trump context. I mean, let's be real, like Biden's things, it was this sort of caricature version of the Bill Clinton laundry list of technocratic proposals. It's a speechwriter's nightmare. It's very hard to make something coherent out of it. Bill pointed out that, White Houses have been using these over the last few decades as a sort of internal organizing principle. And you can imagine the benefit to that. But, there still could be the requirement to send to Congress a written message, which would, perform some of that function. And so there's a case for this on two levels, it seems to me. One is Trump specific, which is to say, if Democrats were to retake the House and the Senate, why on earth should they feel obliged due to just the idea of tradition, which Donald Trump is blowing up anyways? Why should they feel obliged to give him a national podium to lie to America for 2 hours? I mean, that's actually what happened. To Jonathan's point about the fact checking. I mean, even by Trump's standards, almost every alleged factual statement that came out of his mouth, had something wrong with it and was the underpinning of this very weird and misleading case to America. So I don't think there should be an obligation to give somebody a platform to lie to the country. That's first of all. And second of all, just even on a non-Trump specific level, I mean, you sort of see all modern presidents have struggled with this, right? And so they've come up with either the Reagan solution or the Clinton solution. And then Trump's people just fuse those two things together. So the Reagan solution was the bring on everyday people guests. And Trump took that. We haven't mentioned that, but, there were three aspects to it. One was American carnage, dystopian hellscape. One was I'm the greatest in the world, and therefore my country is the greatest in the world. And then the third aspect of it was, I'm the host of America's,
right. Telethon.
Emmy Award winning,
Right.
like performance here. And he actually gave out 6 different medals and commendations in the course of the evening.
How
This, again,
presidential.
everything about Trump 2.0 is the metastasization of even Trump 1.0. I remember when it was like a crazy hokey thing in Trump 1.0 when he handed out the medal to Rush Limbaugh in the middle of the State of the Union speech. And now we did that 6 different times. So there's this sort of weird Carnival Barker aspect of it too. So that's the Reagan approach on steroids, and then the Clinton approach on steroids of just a laundry list of every kind of proposal from, poll tested, eye rolling, technocratic mumbo jumbo. And so why do it?
And there's this other point that's just so hard to watch, I think, the forced partisanship where the Republicans have to stand up and clap while the Democrats look dour and defiant, and then vice versa. Not to mention, by the way, the U.S. Supreme Court that people were really zeroing in on right in front of him. Some of the pictures there, if looks could kill. I just want to stress one thing. I hadn't realized this detail. Like Bill, I didn't watch it. It's really telling to me that he was reading the speech. So everything you're saying is actually the aides having served up, well, we're going to let Trump be Trump, as it were. I guess we don't have a choice. And that says a lot about how the White House tries to manage or not manage him, as the case may be. And one other point about your piece that struck me, Susan, is like, he is a salesman, and this is the moment when you bring the used car back and it's got the muffler and all the problems. And that's very much, the carnival barker who sold you the car is not going to be helping here at all.
The specific point is like, America wants a refund. Look at the polls, right? This is not a speech, even if it made some sense, I suppose, or passages of it to your base, at a time when the CNN poll this week had Trump at 62, 63% disapproval. America's asking for a refund, and that's not the speech that you give to a country in that frame of mind.
We need a lemon law.
You know, the hokey, the medal giving and hero, hero or quasi-hero praising stuff. I do think I saw afterwards and the next morning, I guess Navigator did one of these dial tests, which are not actually, sometimes could be somewhat interesting and informative. People like, actually, I mean, once you're going down this path, why not? I mean, it's more interesting to hear about these people, and Trump is capable of reading the accounts of what they did, and some of them did very admirable things, the helicopter pilot in Venezuela and so forth. People kind of like that, I think. He would have been better off, honestly, just being the game show, the host of the, Americans' achievements, and then go totally patriotic, USA and men's hockey. I used to have the women's hockey team there too. And, he could have gone Reagan in a way. And then the risk, of course, is that people aren't very happy about the economy and they don't approve of his presidency. But maybe you pivot, and maybe they'd approve more if he weren't killing Americans in Minneapolis and weren't doing other crazy things. As I say, it's not as if he has nothing. I guess I am struck by this a little bit. You do have to play the hand you're dealt somewhat. I mean, I don't approve like his foreign policy at all, and I think it's really potentially very disastrous in terms of Europe and the whole world order. And Susan and I have discussed this many times, and John's talked about it a lot too, and Harry, we've all discussed it. Having said that, from a short-term point of view, he could take credit for Venezuela. It was impressive. He could sort of fake take credit for the Gaza sort of agreement, and the hostages did all come back. I mean, you could, same with that, some of the economic stuff, you could give a sort of coherent account of how I've gotten things better. I inherited a very tough situation when I took over. Ukraine, you can't really say much about one way or the other, I suppose. But I'm struck that he didn't really do that much. That's just because he can't constitutionally. He has to praise himself, but he can't really give an account of things out there getting better and sort of, but also not being great, right? Not being the best ever. And he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize and all that. His personal grievance and solipsism and narcissism makes it hard for him to make, I think, the kinds of calculations we're sort of talking about. But having said all that, I mean, people have their views. And I mean, I give the public credit, honestly, for getting, I've been frustrated at times that I'm very frustrated they reelected Trump, and frustrated that they didn't see how horrible some of the things he was doing have been. He has lost 9-10 points in public opinion in a year. That's not nothing. If you start at 49, which is his electoral number and his original number, a year ago when he gave the speech to Congress, it was 49-48. Now in the Times, the average is 40-56. CNN has been down even 36-62. Let's just say 40. That's, I think, conservative, actually. Maybe a little generous to him. You're losing 9 out of 49, 49-40. That means you're losing 1 out of 6 of your supporters. That's a lot in a year. And if that continues down, Republicans are right to think that he'll be at 37 or 36 or 35, and they will get slaughtered, I think, at that point in the midterm. So the public has moved away from him. That's a hard thing to fix once it starts to happen. I say this as someone who was in the George H.W. Bush White House, and the public, unfairly, in my view, moved away from us very, very rapidly in 1991, from like 91% to 38%. Very great achievement of being part of the White House that had the fastest drop ever. And I don't know, were things that terrible by the end of 92? We won the Cold War, we won the Gulf War, the economy was coming back from a mild recession, honestly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But whatever. People have their, it's hard to change people's minds once they get that in their head. But
airing of old grievances.
But again, he would have to. You have to give people. Yeah, I like to do that. He would have to give people some reason to rethink. And I do think this is John's point, which is very important. I mean, that you need to do that. You need to sort of acknowledge their unhappiness and then say, "But look." I mean, Reagan in '82. I went back and looked at this for 2 minutes, just because I was kind of curious of that. After his first year, people were not in a great mood in January of '82, right? I mean, they hadn't gotten inflation out of the economy yet, and we had a recession because Volcker was crushing, was trying to get inflation out of the economy. The Reagan tax cuts had not kicked in yet, so it was a kind of prospective thing, supply-side economics. It was outboarding in America. And Reagan played the hand he had, which was stay the course. You know what? It's going to get better. It's a little rough now, but we're doing the right thing. He had an easier thing to play off because the economy was in such bad shape under Carter, and Carter was perceived as such a failure in terms of Iran hostages and so forth, that he had an easier contrast to make, But even so, he played that hand. It didn't rally everyone right away. They had some House losses, not so much in the Senate in the midterm, but he laid the groundwork for coming back, right? And then he could say at 83 and 84, see, I said if we stayed the course, it'd be better.
And he won a landslide, yeah.
Trump could have tried something like that. But again, I think there the short-term character of Trump and Trumpism and all that just overwhelms any sort of strategic thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think a bottom line here is he's just so clearly a better slashing campaigner than he is president. All right. Well, again, to your point, Bill, that I think is really trenchant. It's maybe a 12-hour story. And the thing that immediately displaced it is the kryptonite still continues to be, it seems, for the administration, the Epstein scandals. And every time anyone scratches a little bit or scrutinizes this partial, very sloppy delivery from DOJ, more problems come up. So now it comes out that a very high profile, whatever you think about its veracity, but a series of allegations and then with the interviews from the FBI just were not disclosed. Let me just put it this way. It's really phenomenal ineptitude. Remember, the law was you do everything, including redactions, by December, and they're way more than a day late and a dollar short. And Democrats are talking cover-up. And I just want to add one other fact, which is when they came out of the gate with their first production, it was 100 pages all about Bill Clinton. So you know that they can select, choose, and call through. So on the one hand, all the revelations about victims, we just found out, I'll say as a former prosecutor, mind-bending that they revealed certain witnesses wanted to cooperate. That will get you shanked in a heartbeat in New York prison. Ineptitude, or is it fair to be using the C word of not the crime, but the cover-up at this point?
I think it's a reasonable question. Yeah. I mean, first of all, you're right to highlight how selective this has been. This is a legal proceeding, to be sure. It's very political. And at every time, Trump's Department of Justice seems to be bending over backwards to protect him. I'd argue they have done it very poorly. And in fact, they have just created more questions than they've tried to tuck away. And this week is a great example. I mean, the State of the Union was indeed drowned out by this revelation earlier in the day. NPR had it first, citing some Daily Beast reporting, I believe, that other media outlets have matched it, that these interviews were not part of the file. There's pages missing, these 302s, and that is a pretty credible...
Pictures.
Yeah, pictures. It's a very serious allegation against Donald Trump. Now, we should be clear, we don't know if that allegation is true, but we should also be clear, it is very suspicious that it's missing from what was released. And then you combine that with, first of all, you have the Department of Justice, which is trying to present itself as a neutral arbiter of getting to the bottom of what happened here, when literally the Department of Justice headquarters in Washington currently flies a huge banner out front that has President Trump's face on it. We combine that with what the Republicans in the House have been doing to try to do his bidding by trying to shift blame on the Clintons. And this week, we've had depositions by former President Bill Clinton and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in Chappaqua. After months of negotiations, the Clintons agreed to do it, wanted it public. Republicans said no. Which I have reported, and others as well, that some of the White House, that makes some of the White House pretty leery, because that's setting a precedent for President Trump, perhaps, or members of his cabinet to also be called for depositions at some point, if not now, but down the road if the Democrats take control. And as Secretary Clinton said it at the end of this week, she's like, look, I never even met Jeffrey Epstein, and more or less saying this is such a clumsy effort to redirect when it's very clear, and almost like an embarrassing game of mistaken identity, where the former president and former first lady were called to testify, when it's the current president and current first lady who actually appear all over these Epstein emails and even in photographs with them.
I mean, that doesn't seem like a hard leap, does it? Well, you had Clinton, you should have, for starters, Howard Lutnick, but also Trump. The first time ever a former president was forced to testify. Truman did it, but voluntarily. And the big thing, though, to John's point is they were forced, they had no leverage at all, knowing that Comer would love to vote out contempt. And who would be behind it? You serve it up to the Department of Justice. Pam Bondi could have happily, because it would have pleased Trump, actually green-lighted a criminal prosecution against them. there's this kind of anti-Clinton virus that just won't go away, I think, in the veins of a lot of the right wing, but it's hurt them before. Thinking about Hillary's deposition, how did she handle it? And are they the dog that caught the car? Is it a mistake to try to divert attention onto the Clintons because they're going to get zinged?
Look, we're talking about it. So unfortunately, it succeeded in that sense, because what we should be talking about is that a member of the cabinet was with Jeffrey Epstein after he had already been convicted of being, a sex criminal. Okay. So that's a sitting member of the cabinet, and the sitting president and first lady, as you guys pointed out, not only all over these files, or except where they've been deleted for what appears to be very questionable reasons that we don't understand. And the idea that these files have been released and so many people have lost their jobs, find themselves the subject of criminal investigations, not only in the United States, but around the world. Look at the difference between what's happening in the United Kingdom, where basically the Epstein files have engulfed the government of British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. He's lost his chief of staff. The former British ambassador to Washington is under criminal investigation. The former Prince Andrew is under criminal investigation. This is happening in Norway. In the United States, it's not only the final catastrophic blow up of Larry Summers's career, but, George Mitchell is having to take his name off of the Mitchell Institute as a result of the disclosure of these files. And on you go. I think the new head of the World Economic Forum was forced to resign the other day. Bill Gates in a, sort of slow burn scandal there. And, it can be rage producing when you see it. To me, it's kind of similar to the Me Too dynamic in Trump's first term, where so many people face consequences, but sort of bubbling beneath the surface is this kind of rage in a large swath of America that the person who should be held accountable, who's in the position of ultimate power, is not being held accountable. And so I think that's a dynamic we're seeing here. And I just have to say, it's kind of hard to read all the pieces about the Clintons, A, lumping them together, B, here we are once again, she literally never met the guy. There's plenty. You want to criticize Hillary Clinton? Come on. There's plenty to criticize her about, but it reminds me of her being accountable in the eyes of so many people for her own husband cheating on her. I mean, the toxic anti-woman climate in this country has been exacerbated and magnified in the Trump 2.0 presidency in the same way that it was in the 1.0 presidency. And, what are we presented with in terms of our public sphere right now? A small handful of MAGA women in the cabinet who have literally been forced to physically transform their appearances into a disgusting caricature of femininity in order to please Donald Trump, while at the same time we have women's rights being rolled back, and literally the former Secretary of State and First Lady being dragged in to testify in a scandal involving a disgusting exploiter and abuser of women who she never met.
Yeah, the Hillary Clinton thing was just idiotic. I mean, they should just call Bill Clinton. I mean, Bill Clinton does have some exposure here. Let's not kid ourselves. And there's nice photos of him in there. I mean, I'm happy to see if Bill Clinton did. I wouldn't mind learning more about exactly how close he was to Epstein. I don't think it's necessarily relevant to anything much because he's not charged with any crimes, presumably, and it was after he was president. It seems like you got to know him and stuff. But there are two coherent positions, it seems to me, to take on the Epstein matter in general. One, it's a horrible scandal. It's a scandal of the ruling parts of the ruling class. It's been handled terribly by administrations for 25 years or 20 years, and really just more than terribly, but really disgracefully. And it needs to all be exposed. Could Trump have gone down that path? He rhetorically did a little bit, of course, as a candidate, and certainly MAGA world did. He could have. I think it would be a little tricky. I knew this guy, but he does have that line about how it's sort of half true, well, quarter true, that he broke with him when he might have learned about the investigation of him. He could pretend he didn't know. He knew Epstein liked younger women, but he didn't think it was underage girls. And anyway, he could have had a bit of a revelation about how horrible it was after the fact. Or you just had to stick with their original line, which wasn't crazy. I mean, they got a huge amount of criticism when they put out that memo on July 6th, Bondi and Patel, about we found nothing. But I remember this is one of the few things I've got to say I got right, I think, in general in the last few years, in real time. Once you do that, you've got to stick with it. They could have stonewalled, and I don't believe they wouldn't have, incidentally. We wouldn't have gotten these papers. It would have been a criticism. It would have kept chugging along a bit. But at the end of the day, they would say, I'm sorry, we're not overriding this judgment of professionals that there was this judgment that the Biden administration seems to have made. If they thought there were people who should be indicted, they should have done. We're not going to send out files with unverified FBI 302s interrogating people, some of whom clearly weren't actually telling the truth, presumably, and some of them are just, disturbed, unfortunately, and so forth, and just shut it down. They would have taken some hits on it, but they probably could have sustained that. They ended up panicking, I think, in July, and then they had we're looking at it again, and then Blanche goes to see Maxwell, and then we're really then at that point, I think the cover-up starts to unravel, and cover-ups are hard to manage when they're unraveling, and we've seen that over the last 6 months, and of course it's a cover-up. I mean, how can you look at Todd Blanche going to see Ghislaine Maxwell there and then moving her to a nicer prison and think we're not in the business of trying to prevent certain stuff from coming out? Now, if there's stuff they don't want out because Trump would be even more injured by it, then they're in a cover-up situation. They haven't done that very well either, and I guess we'll see what happens on it. But it has hurt them quite a lot. But I would say, incidentally, I think people are upset about it, not quite as Trump specifically, maybe, as we were saying. I mean, they are really upset by what has been revealed. And I am upset about it. And it's horrifying. And I do think that the kind of Ro Khanna line about the Epstein class and all that has enough truth to it that it will be potent politically for quite a while, I think, both in 2026 and conceivably in 2027, 2028. I mean, this has been a pretty horrifying window. I mean, Susan's absolutely right about also to misogyny and views about women and the exploitation of women. And Trump is just so incapable of even pretending to care about that. He had Epstein survivors there, right? In the gallery. I didn't see it, as I said, but I think he could have said, look, it's been complicated handling this. And I just want to make clear that I knew Jeffrey back when. I didn't realize what he was doing. I want to say we all feel terrible about what happened to you. And I want to say, as president of the United States, this shouldn't happen here. It wouldn't. I mean, it's not Trump's style, but any normal president would have done it, incidentally. It's a totally obvious thing to do. He has never said that ever in this whole 6 months.
Because he's not a normal president.
I know, but he's not even a normal human being. He's not even a normal human being.
No.
Because dishonest, you know what? All those people you mentioned who've quit and who've maybe justifiably, honestly, I'd say been sort of driven off out of respectable office a little bit. They've all said that, in fact. I mean, it's maybe disingenuous, maybe it's honest. They regret it. They feel bad. They have great sympathy. Trump can't even make himself do that. And I do think in that respect, when you have what's been exposed about the breadth and depth of the Epstein scandal, and you can't have the president of the United States say this is something that shouldn't have happened here, and then while maintaining his own innocence and all that. That really does rub people the wrong way. So I think it's less that people think Trump was necessarily involved in everything and more that he just hasn't even sounded like an appropriate national leader in this respect.
Yeah, well, and I do want to add, I've been kind of gobsmacked. I think the story has gone a lot bigger than Trump. But to your cover-up point and the sort of classic political maxims here, remember, there's something I always come back. He was really adamant about trying to keep this stuff from coming out. He woodshedded his allies what was that about? But then he said, forced into a corner, everything has to come out. And it's the timing now. So there are, by some accounts, like Ro Khanna, a couple million pages still out there. And it's at this point that Todd Blanche is saying, nothing to see here, move along. We've done our job. And here's how many pages we've produced. That doesn't speak at all to what about the, is it 5? Is it 50? Is it 1,000 documents that have to do with Trump? And, they've thought they could kind of cabinet, but as more and more comes out about other people, the hydraulic force is just not going away. Comer speculates maybe the committee might subpoena Letnick, the Commerce Secretary who's been caught in a lie, et cetera. You would normally think that makes it inevitable. Is there going to be a scalp? Is it now inevitable that Letnick is hauled in, especially when this is the one area maybe where Congress has shown some backbone and been out front of Trump?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've been thinking about a lot in the last day or two. So to recap, yes, Cohen was asked yesterday outside of the Secretary Clinton's deposition if Lutnick could get called, and he allowed for the possibility. And that came the same day that some photograph of Lutnick and Epstein on Epstein Island, which had resurfaced in the material, was suddenly pulled back, which raised a lot of questions. Why is DOJ doing that? Adding to the cover-up speculation. Whether Lutnick gets called or not, you're right. It's possible. Epstein is one of the very few issues where Republicans in Congress are willing to defy the president, but they still largely take their cues from him. And if Trump sends signals, no, I don't want this, and they probably won't. And by my reporting, Trump's not bothered really with Lutnick's presence in the Epstein files. Certainly not in terms of a moral legal issue. Maybe just as an embarrassment to his administration, but. It doesn't seem like that's moving the needle either. But the bigger question I have also coming to grips with is like Trump, you mentioned scalps. Trump has prided himself this time around. No scalps. That's a policy. Like, we're not going to fire people. We're not going to give the media, conventional wisdom, Democrats, whatever, some sort of victory here. I'm not going to admit a mistake. And he really regrets the turnover of his first term. He wishes he could do that differently this time around, because there have been a number of cabinet officials who could be easily dispatched right now. And frankly, it would be viewed favorably by Republicans. He might get a boost in the media. Lutnick's the most recent example, but there have been moments where that could be Kash Patel, that could be Pam Bondi, it could be Pete Hegseth. The list goes on and on about people. Kristi Noem probably tops of the list, who could go and I think would actually be a bit of a boost for the Trump team. But he just seems refusing to do that. In part because perhaps he foresees a difficult confirmation battle ahead for a replacement, but also I think he just doesn't want to give in to his opponents, and also he doesn't prize competence. Most of all, he prizes loyalty, and the team he has now are true believers who he knows will do what he asks.
Can I add a word on that? Because I think it's such an interesting contrast with the first term, but I think the contrast is reasonable in this way. If you staffed your administration with establishment people who aren't loyal to you, particularly, or the way Trump thinks of loyalty, and who are stopping you from doing things, he liked firing them. I mean, he liked showing his power by getting rid of them. Now, he didn't always replace them with people who were more loyal or were better, and so it didn't always work out well for him. But in a way, given the situation he put himself in, and in the first term, it made sense for him to fire these people who were standing in his way. No one, as Jon said, is standing in his way. None of those people we've mentioned. And so he has no reason to fire them in that respect. B, they're doing what he wants. They're a little incompetent at doing what he wants, but they're doing what he wants. And he can't be quite this confident that if he lets these people go, the next guy will come in and have in the back of his mind or her mind, I got to be a little careful about doing everything he wants because it didn't work out so well for Pam Bondi. So I'm going to be a little more responsible. I'm going to be a little more respectful of norms. So in a weird way, he's right not to fire any of these people. I don't think it would be wise for him to do so. He'd get like a one day of good press from, all of us and, from the Republicans on the Hill. And I'll put it this way in a very simple and slightly exaggerated way, but only slightly. If you're running a big criminal enterprise, you can't fire your collaborators.
Right.
You can't afford to. They know everything.
They can all drop the dime on you.
They know everything. Mafia people do not fire like their junior colleagues in the mafia. Now, occasionally they just get rid of them if they're too dangerous. But mostly you got to keep them on board once you start it. And the path he has started down, which is so much massive corruption, so much destruction of any rule of law or regular procedures in any of these, in the Defense Department, the Justice Department, DHS, he's got to be very careful about who he dumps. And that's why, incidentally, as soon as he dumps someone, they get another job, right? Or they get taken care of on the outside, and a huge amount of money floods to them. So Ed Martin can't get confirmed, so he's somewhere else in the Justice Department. And other people, can't make it as assistant one of these U.S. attorneys, so they find something other thing. He's got to hug these people close because he can't afford to have them turn on him. And whereas if Jim Mattis turned on him or John Kelly or something, well, those people weren't his people anyway.
I think this is a really important point. Bringing in new people is actually riskier for Trump at this moment. And one, I think Jonathan's right, the confirmation is already a big question mark, in the Senate. But putting that aside, why does Marco Rubio have 3 jobs, right? Why is he the national security advisor, the Secretary of State, and the acting national archivist? He may have more jobs by the end of all this as well, because I think having selected people and brought them very far down the road of doing things that will get you in a lot of trouble in any other context, who else do you bring into the gang at this point? And I think that explains a lot of the Epstein story. I really do. I think that, you know, Donald Trump is guilty of doing whatever it is that we don't know about that he did with Epstein. Whatever Howard Lutnick did with Epstein is almost certainly a lot less than what Donald Trump did, who had a much closer relationship for many years, even by his own account, with Epstein than Howard Lutnick ever did. So, again, I think the chaos flows from Trump. The chaos is not really Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski. It's Donald Trump. And I think, in fact, you could argue that this is all that Trump 2.0 is a very interesting demonstration of that theory of the case, right? There was chaos in Trump 1.0, despite having people like Jim Mattis and John Kelly who pushed back against it. There's a different, much more over the top version of it this time now that he's hired a different set of people. But there's the through lines are because Donald Trump is the through line here.
So true. And two very quick points, and then let's move on. The first is in that set of people who might otherwise be on the block from that Jonathan mentioned, 4 of them or so are the most controversial nominees that he really went all out for and said in those terms, we can't let the Dems get a scalp. They've all proven to be controversial, problematic. Kennedy, Noem, Hegseth, Patel. It's been this sort of all-in strategy from the start. The second point is I do think to the mob boss mentality that Bill mentions, a lot of the people are staying in the fold. Maybe they're true believers, but they also think there's a pardon for them down the line. And when you actually cut someone loose and they don't have that assurance anymore, that could really matter. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we stir up a discussion around cocktails. Make your own or buy them ready to drink. There's no question that mixing a delicious cocktail is truly an art form. Precise measurements and proportions, creative substitutions, the presentation itself, and even the speed of delivery are all factors that earn great mixologists the reputations they deserve. But for people who may not stock things like triple sec and bitters, a ready-to-drink cocktail that's pre-measured and mixed just might be worth pulling off the shelf. Ready-to-drink cocktails don't necessarily give you the satisfaction of creating a drink from scratch, but they do offer up undeniable convenience, removing the complexity of recipes, the burden of acquiring ingredients, and the time it takes to measure, pour, mix, crush, stir, and of course, repeat. Plus, you still have the ability to customize your drink, adding a splash of this or that, here or there, to your liking. So, whether you're into customization or convenience, ready-to-drink cocktails give you a little bit of both. Now, who says you can't have your cocktail and drink it too? So what's better, customization or convenience? Probably depends on the situation. It can be fun crafting your own cocktail, but when time is short, ready-to-drink cocktail sure does hit the spot. Either way, you can grab all the ingredients you need for a great craft cocktail or get your ready-to-go favorite at Total Wine & More.
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine & More for today's A Spirited Debate. The story that maybe is eclipsing even Epstein, at least today as we tape. So, over the past few weeks, it seemed like little by little, but now all at once, we may be getting into some kind of military conflict with Iran. This morning, the U.S. has advised its embassy staff in Israel, if you're going to leave now. And obviously, Israel is in the middle of all this. There's reporting that the administration prefers Israel do a first strike. What's the game plan here with respect to Iran as it now, people were thinking about it because of its plunging ratings before the State of the Union in a wag the dog way. We're on the other side of that, but he's still beset with all these problems. Are we getting into some new, big, thick mess in the Middle East?
Well, first of all, to the point about what is it, right?
Yeah,
so we don't
right,
know what will happen, and it could be by the time, this airs, we already have some answers. But we do know that Donald Trump has assembled an incredible, vast American military armada of both air and sea power in the Middle East aimed at threatening Iran. His State of the Union, as we said, did not really illuminate because I think Trump is in a bind here. He's got a huge military buildup with unclear aims, even an unclear precipitating factor in the sense that, as he said in the State of the Union, we may or may not go to war in Iran in order to obliterate a nuclear program, which I already claimed we obliterated. And actually, he repeated that claim in the State of the Union address at the same time. He said, yes, I obliterated it. And also, we might have to go to war to get rid of it again. Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's kind of all-purpose envoy, was on television a few days ago, and he claimed, and it was subsequently in the Wall Street Journal, had very good reporting pointing out that this was not accurate according to, experts and publicly available satellite information, whatever. But Witkoff went on TV and claimed that Iran was as little as 1 week away from, reestablishing weapons-grade material. Trump also made this kind of intriguing but fragment sentence claim about, Iran might have missiles, ballistic missiles that could threaten the continental United States itself. So maybe that's the prerequisite for war. We're also seeing lots of reporting suggesting, as you pointed out, Harry, that this is a joint U.S.-Israel production in some way that has yet to be made fully clear to us. And then there is the factor, which I think it's really important for us all to think about, which is what's been happening inside Iran itself, which is this incredible, bloody crackdown of an enormous scale against internal dissenters and protesters. Trump cited a number in the speech of, I believe, 32,000 dead. By whatever measure it is ultimately, this is one of the bloodiest, most tyrannical uses of force against its own population we've seen in modern times. Tiananmen Square, by contrast, was really only a couple thousand people who were killed. So is Donald Trump going to take the United States to war in the Middle East because of human rights or the internal situation in Iran? That's almost inconceivably distant from the vision of foreign policy that he has sold to the country and his followers over the last decade. So, I mean, my basic take is that Trump prefers militarized displays of one-off awesome American military power, and then he wants to sort of, claim victory and walk away. He doesn't have the zeal, the appetite, the strategic focus or discipline to launch a longer-term operation. And also, he's very wary of sort of metastasizing an uncontrollable war in the Middle East. Like, that is like one of the things that he is really, I think, genuinely afraid of as a politician and as a person. So I would look for more in the realm of spectacular strikes and, demanding concessions from Iran in the wake of that.
I think there's also a possibility still of a deal, but for Trump, it would need to be like a clear win. It would have to be better than the Obama nuclear deal that Trump himself pulled us out of. Like he'd need to be able to claim a real victory in order to back down, because he is afraid of also showing some weakness. I completely agree with Susan that they don't want like a full-on, wide, weeks-long, months-long conflict. That's something that Trump, I think, really does not want. He would much prefer a targeted, limited strike. But targeted, limited strikes sometimes turn into wider conflicts. You can't control it. The other side gets a vote.
Often.
And I think they're still, as of last night, still debating what to do. I don't know that Trump has made his decision. They have certainly now put things in place with the embassy warning, the assets in the region, that if Trump gives the order to go, they can go. And I think what I've been told is he was pretty eager to do it a few weeks ago during the height of those protests. But they simply couldn't. They didn't have the assets in the region. And now they're there. The protests have largely been quashed. So it's unclear exactly what the motive is or the ticking clock. Does this have to be now? And I think there's a lot of people in Washington who are wondering about that. But it is very possible that, he is so in love with the idea, with the military strength that he was able to display in Venezuela, that he will order up something similar this time around. But even that could be, we may be on the precipice of one of the most consequential decisions of his presidency. But a lot can change in the next handful of days.
You would normally think that a president would sort of prepare the way much more than he has with the American people, but an autocrat wouldn't, and maybe it's an autocrat's path to war. Bill, I want to ask you for the last word here, but to John's point, what do you think, if he does something, is the minimum he'll need to claim success? Some kind of solid nuclear deal? Do we need regime change? What's his, price for the kind of quick, spectacular pyrotechnics that Susan's talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I've been surprised at the huge movement of military forces there, which, I mean, you don't need those, incidentally, for the one-off thing, which is what I assume he would like, a Venezuela type thing, or what he did before in Iran, and just another version of that, I suppose. And then he'll take credit that the nuclear program has been set back more, or they'll have some deal that's no better than Obama's deal, but he'll say it's better, and that's adequate probably for him.
Right.
Except you don't need all the forces there. I got to say, I've always assumed he was extremely avert. The one lesson he's learned from politics, one lesson of the lessons he's learned over 50 years is don't start wars, especially in the Middle East. They get out of control. They hurt presidents, whether they're well-intentioned or not, and so forth. So I've always assumed that's the one thing he would shy away from. But you don't need all these forces to do what he did in the summer. I mean, he did it in the summer without the right. I mean, we can fly B-2s from here and from Europe, and we can fly other things from the air. The people I know in defense world are a little, therefore, who would share everything John and Susan just said about what they assume Trump wants, are a little freaked out by just the forces that are there are the forces you have for a weeks-long bombing air campaign that really tries to either destroy the regime, basically, and create the conditions where the Iranian people would rise up. And I think they haven't quashed, my personal view, talking to people, a couple of people who know about this stuff, is maybe they haven't quashed things as much as people think. So the people might rise up again. That would, I guess, be the best case for Trump. He gets lucky, some bombing, and then there is a regime overthrow. Who knows what comes next, but it can't be worse, presumably. So maybe. So I don't quite know if that's what he has in mind or not. But the moving of all the forces there, now maybe there's just he likes being a tough guy. He moves more forces than he needs to a place, but it has a certain dynamic of its own, right? And people I know who are normally pretty calm about the world are pretty freaked out by what could happen over there. And as John said, the unintended consequences of these things. Trump can think to himself, they can sit around and say, I think we could get this deal, and that would be nice, but the Iranians get a vote and other parties get a vote, incidentally, and other nations can do other things at the same time, whether it's Russia or China. I mean, these are very uncharted waters, I think, and dangerous ones, actually. And again, for what? No one seriously thinks the Iranian nuclear program is as much of a threat now as it was to anyone, let alone to us. It's never really been a direct threat to us, honestly, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't care about it. It can destabilize the region. It can attack friends and allies of ours. It has been a threat in the past. There were diplomatic efforts. There were talk about military efforts to deal with it. We've done some of each. We've killed Soleimani, who arguably we could tie into the kind of, retribution for killing Americans and for the war on terror. What's the urgency now? There's literally the nuclear thing is totally unurgent, despite what was it Witkoff or someone said to the New York Post is like literally crazy. I mean, half the thing is buried under a hill. Could they dig it out in a mountain? Could they dig it out in 2 years? Sure. Well, that gives us time to work for 2 years. On the human rights or democracy side, as Susan said, there was urgency. Maybe there still is, but that's not the rhetoric. That was not the rhetoric of the State of the Union, right? So I don't know. I'm pretty worried. I mean, you are playing with fire when you threaten war, move troops to a place, talk about the urgency of doing it, and have no theory of really, I don't think, of exactly what you're trying to accomplish. And again, if I don't have great confidence, honestly, in this team thinking this through either. So I'm pretty worried about it, just as a sort of matter of what it could do to the world,
Look, that's the final point that ties the whole episode, going back to the State of the Union and the absence of any kind of real policy and just the vitriol. You've got an erratic president who could be moved by some little insult or whatever, now that all the toys are there, to really do something imprudent and reckless.
And no congressional authorization for the use of force, which whenever you think of Iraq, there was like a kind of a big debate for months and a big congressional vote, and the Democrats, to their regret, voted half of them voted for it and so forth.
I think we all agree that that's no deterrent to him either.
Well, but it changes things going forward, though, just in the sense that no one has any. if he had gone to Congress, I'm not sure he couldn't have gotten a congressional vote to authorize the use of force against Iran. Iran is not very popular, but not getting that does expose him, I think, in a way that's very unusual in modern American politics, to a kind of personal blowback almost if this thing goes in a bad way.
Although you have to imagine if they start in, that is when, in the playbook of modern presidents, he'll go for some kind of something if they're already there. You're disagreeing, Bill. Tell me why.
Because I think if he starts in, people are going to say, we're going to say, I mean, I would not vote. I'm a hawk on Iran. We're halfway down some road that Trump has got us on, and you're going to vote to authorize it then? I think people will say, forget it. Maybe some Republicans wouldn't support it, incidentally. So I don't know. It's easier to get authorization for the use of force before you start using the force generally, I think. I don't know.
All right, we have to leave it there. We're out of time on it just seems to me like a very volatile, fluid moment with exactly the wrong guy at the helm. We just have a minute for our 5 words or fewer feature. Kash Patel defended his, he had a little bit of extracurricular frolicking, and could have happened to anyone during the Olympics, but he was there. We were told to provide security expertise. What kind, 5 words or fewer, please, what kind of security expertise did Kash Patel provide to the USA men's hockey team, with whom he was partying after their overtime victory against Canada?
Kash Patel, FBI, federal Budweiser inspector.
Nice. MAGA beer chugging.
Yeah, sort of manosphere attractive behavior.
Yeah,
He thinks.
I was thinking
That's so
about.
great. I don't know. There's something really creepy about that, Bill.
I know. I feel, as I thought of it just now,
The
I felt creepy
manosphere,
even
yeah.
saying it,
It is it makes you immediately feel bad things.
All right, I had beer pong and stuff like that, but security. So my maybe boring answer: wiretap on Team Canada's bench. Okay, we're out of time. Thanks so much, Susan, Bill, and John, on a really, in some ways, it seems to me, dramatic and unsettled moment. Hope to see you soon on Talking Feds. Until then, talk to you later. Thank you so much, Susan, Bill, and John. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review the show. Check us out on Substack at harrylittman.substack.com, where I'll be posting 2 or 3 bulletins a week breaking down the various threats to constitutional norms and the rule of law. Paid Substack subscribers can now get Talking Feds episodes completely ad-free. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes and my daily takes on top legal stories. Talking Feds has joined forces with The Contrarian. I'm a founding contributor to this bold new media venture committed to reviving the diversity of opinion that feels increasingly rare in today's news landscape, where legacy media seems to be tacking toward Trump for business reasons rather than editorial ones. Find out more at contrarian.substack.com. Thanks for tuning in. And don't worry, as long as you need answers, the feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Luke Cregan and Katie Upshaw. Associate producer, Becca Havian. Sound engineering by Matt McArdle. Rosie Don Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahadranathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers, and production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.